Good afternoon, everybody. This is John Cole, also called Cybertal, coming back at you with all things chess. Took a bit of a break. I had a little bit of a vacay for myself. Went out on an adventure and had some good times, but we're back to the chess grind now. We're continuing an examination of hanging pawns. We're going to be winding up how to handle the side with the hanging pawns here soon, and then we're going to move on to examining how to fight against hanging pawns. We've been trying to look at some examples of using d4, d5, just as creating a pure pass pawn. This will be sort of a hybrid of the two. This is a game where d4, d5 creates a very strong pass pawn that sort of cuts the board in half, but almost by definition, that also creates a lot of kingside attacking possibilities. So it's virtually impossible to have a pure game where d4, d5 is only a positional device. Because with that push, you're always creating attacking chances for your side, just because you're gobbling up space, you're cutting the board in half, and you're creating a lot of activity for your pieces. But this would be another good example of the d4, d5 push not necessarily being attached to an immediate kingside assault, where it's more of a positional device overall. This is sort of a normal game. This isn't two legends. This is Anton Kovalyov, certainly a very strong player, against Teddy Coldman, someone sort of in my neck of the woods in terms of strength. Kovalyov is white, c4, e6. Good already. This is my main repertoire, so this is very comfortable for me to look at. Castle, b3, just an aside. I went over some of this in our previous video, but d4 here would be the mainline Catalan. The advantage for white choosing this move order of delaying d4 is that you've avoided the lines where black plays bishop b4 check, and then induces the bishop to come to d2 before dropping back to e7. Whereas after d4, you sort of lock black into supposedly a slightly more passive way of playing against the Catalan. I don't really believe it, though. I think black is perfectly fine. Plus, playing this as white is just such a huge imposition. At a certain level, there's just so much precise opening theory that you need to know that makes it fairly prohibitive to play for both sides. So b3 is a lot more flexible. You can still transpose the Catalan at some points, but white keeps his options open. It's a lot more flexible, and there's a lot less theory to understand or memorize, in my opinion. b6. This is one of the ways black can play, not necessarily the way I would play personally, but knight c3, knight c6, queen e2. So this is sort of a mainline tabia for the ready variation. As I mentioned in my previous treatment of the Pano-Mecking game, white really has two plans here. He has the plan to achieve d4, usually by bringing his rooks to the c and d file. He also has another plan to play knight e1, and then f4, g4, and then some sort of kingside pawn storm. Both are equally good, in my opinion. It's just sort of a matter of taste and how black responds. The way black arranges his pieces will often dictate which plan you go with, so it's important not to be too locked into one plan or the other. It's important to be flexible and have both those plans in your mental database. Queen d7. In my opinion, this sort of is a mnemonic device for white to look at the d4 plan, because the queen is keeping itself on this potentially opening d file, so that sort of locks black into a certain amount of lost time if the d file ever does open. So that's sort of an additional inducement for white to choose the d4 pawn break. Plus queen d7, it keeps an eye on the f5 square, which is sort of a subtle point, but it makes an f4, f5 pawn break a little bit more difficult. So both those factors, in my opinion, sort of militate for white going with the d4 plan in this particular position. In the previous game we looked at, Mecking chose knight b4, which basically forces d4 immediately. Rook c8 is probably the most flexible move here. And this sort of aims specifically against d4, because it aims at that c4 pawn for this c file potentially opening after the d4 break. So rook c8 is actually specifically aimed at the d4 break, but it does nothing against the kingside pawn storm, which is the plan I would go with white here. I think the main line is just rook a d1, keeping flexible for now, and then playing knight e1, f4, g4, and getting on with the kingside pawn assault. Queen d7 makes a d4 break a little bit stronger by keeping the queen in this potentially opening file. Rook a d1. As you continue to learn about chess, you will learn that one of the most torturous questions in all of chess is the which rook question. Which rook should we put on the d file? Should we put the f rook or the a rook? In my opinion, the most important factor is to not spend too much of your thinking time choosing which rook, to just sort of make a practical decision at some point. In this particular position, I think the f rook belongs on d1 to militate for the d4 break. This rook has a natural square on c1 that can eventually go to. Also, like we said, the queen d7 move sort of discourages the kingside pawn storm a little bit, so there's less reason for this rook to be on f1 at all. So rook a d1, not necessarily bad. I just think rook f d1 is a little bit more accurate because it allows that other rook to come to c1. With this rook on d1, this rook doesn't really have a great square. It can stay on f1, where it's not going to be an open file anytime soon, or it can go to e1, where it doesn't really accomplish all that much. So, a little bit of a mistake, in my opinion. Rook f d8, this is a mistake. This doesn't actually stop d4. This move would be good if it actually forced white to spend another move preparing d4, but it doesn't. So, otherwise, this rook just doesn't belong on d8. It doesn't do anything on d8. Rook f e8 is a better prophylactic move. d4, then bishop f8, and this is a very common prophylactic move in the ready. This bishop on b2 almost always turns into an incredibly strong piece, because d4, d5 will be achieved, and that bishop's just going to be screaming down the long diagonal. So the bishop prophylactically moves back to f8 to defend the potentially weak g7 square. Also, it's unmasking this rook on e8, so this is sort of a method of prophylactics against the d5 push being achieved, because here, d5 would just be a flat-out mistake because the black would take, and the queen on e2 would be attacked. So this, I would say this is a balanced position. There's plenty of fight to come here. Rook f d8 is a little bit of a mistake. This just allows white to continue pushing. So d4, c6, d4. I give one line. I don't want to go up the video too much with potential variations. As usual, the game notes will be in the comments. But queen c8. I have a couple of very interesting lines here. d5, this is a very thematic push in the ready. And if you play the ready, this is the sort of line you need to be looking at. This is an exchange sacrifice, but it's actually quite good for white. ed, bishop a6. And this is sort of a key position for looking at this variation. If you haven't really played the ready much, this might be surprising, but white is on the verge of being positionally winning here. White's bishop pair are just completely dominating the entire board. This bishop is screaming down the long diagonal. This bishop is unopposed, so it can go back to g2 and rule that long diagonal. These central pawns are incredibly strong. White's just planning on ramming these up the board with e5, d6, and so forth. Black is up a full exchange, and he could potentially go up another pawn after knight x8-2. But the positional factors of white having that incredibly strong bishop pair and having those incredibly strong passed pawns completely overmatch those. White is on the verge of winning here. This would be a fantastic position play. So give that variation a look. There's also another sub-variation with similar play. So similar position. Black is up in exchange and a pawn, but white's bishop pair plus his incredibly strong central duo completely overmatch that. So give that variation a look. It's an incredibly fun position to play with. But CD is normal. Knight a5. This is nearly decisive positional error. Sometimes we laugh at old-fashioned positional dictums like a knight on the rim is grim. But there's a reason those exist, because sometimes a knight on the rim is just, in fact, quite grim. And here, because there's not a rook on c8 backing up this attack on the c-pawn, this knight on a5 for right now is just completely out of the game. Now, if black is able to achieve some sort of pressure on the c-pawn, this knight could potentially make sense in the future. But right now, it is just misplaced and out of the game, and it's abandoning the fight for the e5 square, which is sort of a key square for this kind of structure. Bishop f8 is much better. This is a usual prophylactic move for this variation. It's less good here because the rook's not on e8, which it really should be. One potential line. This is probably the best for white. Knight e5. This is a similar theme to the Pano-Mecking game that we looked at a couple weeks ago. As soon as that d5 break is achieved, the knight hops into e5 because it's looking at that c6 square. and then knight e4. Notice how, as soon as that d5 break is played, this bishop on b2 becomes extraordinarily strong. So white can start funneling his pieces over to the king side to achieve some sort of attack. Next, e. This is just a representative variation, but this is pretty much close to best play for both sides. Queen h5. And this is a very precise stance. Just this is sort of a key sequence. Notice how white goes out of his way to completely weaken black's kingside pawns before doing anything else. And white's getting at least his material back, but notice how incredibly strong these bishops are. This bishop on b2 especially is now just an absolute monster. In so many ready variations, this is more or less what white is playing for the entire game. Just the chance for these bishops to go absolutely nuts. And as always, it's this d5 push that really enables that to occur, because it completely opens up the center and it opens up this long diagonal for the bishop on b2. That's why you always look to your pawn breaks. Your pawn breaks are sort of the engine for your play, and the gasoline in your cylinders, in other words. And d4-d5 is really the only pawn break in this position, so it sort of gives white a greater feeling of control over the dynamics of the position, whereas black's sort of waiting to respond to white's dynamics. But this would be more or less the best that black can achieve. Bishop f8 is the most solid, whereas knight a5 sort of tucks this piece out of the game. d5, just this is the push you want to achieve in this sort of structure. d4-d5, when you have hanging pawns, we've seen some examples where white doesn't play for d5 and just shoots for a kingside attack without that. But generally with the hanging pawn structure, you want to get those pawns moving and achieve that d5 break. That's sort of what your position is organized around. ed, knight x, d5, g6, queen d3, that's the best move. Knight e5 would be a little bit of a mistake. This would sell white's advantage too cheaply. White's still better here. White's got the bishop pair. This pawn in d5 is definitely more of a strength than a weakness. But now that the knight's coming into c4, it's going to be hopping into d6, so black's going to be no longer down that piece. So it gives black a chance to consolidate, whereas after queen d3, that just sort of keeps this knight on a5 completely out of the game. So for the time being, black is still down a piece, which is generally what you want to achieve in chess. So white doesn't want to be trading pieces off the board. He's got the advantage of dynamics. This pawn in d5 is cutting the board in half, so it's keeping these queenside pieces out of play. White shouldn't have any interest in trading pieces. You want to keep the pieces on and go for an attack in this sort of position. Queen g4, looking for play. f6 would be another solid move, blunting the bishop out. But this is still quite bad. You know, the f6 move created another internal weakness on e6, and that bishop's going to fill it. This is pretty horrible for black. So queen g4, knight d2. This is a poor choice. White's absolutely justified in pushing for more here. Rook fe8 or rook fe1. When you're in doubt, develop more. Just develop as quickly as you can. You want to get your pieces mobilized quickly, basically at all times. When you look at the games of the really great players, you'll be struck at how quickly and directly they just get their pieces developed and then figure out something fancy afterwards. Rook fe1, that's white's last unmobilized piece, so it just makes sense to mobilize that last piece. One example line, knight a5. And this is pretty much positionally winning for white. He's got the bishop pair. He's got this incredibly strong pawn in d5. It's not a weakness. It's an isolated pawn, so there are types of positions where this sort of pawn can be a weakness, but not here. This pawn is incredibly mobile. You know, white's just playing d6 to push it down the board. This should be a winning advantage for white. This is incredibly strong. Knight d2 is just too indirect. White's justified in pushing for more. Rook a c8, so black's continuing to mobilize. This is good play. Bishop 1. Again, this is too delicate. White is justified in playing for more. When you have this sort of advantage, this pawn on d5 is incredibly strong. White's pieces are all better than their black counterparts. This knight on a5 temporarily puts black down a piece. White is justified in playing for more. Bishop a1 is just way too slow, and it's allowing black time to get consolidated. h3 I like. It just sort of nudged the black queen away, forced to declare her intentions. Bishop e4. Then rook c1. And this fights for the c file and also takes up the c4 square, so we know this knight can never reactivate itself. Notice queen taking is impossible because of bishop f5. But otherwise, white still has a very nice advantage. Bishop a1 more or less nearly gives it away, just because black's able to finally get mobilized and get some counterplay. Bishop f8, very nice solid move, defending the g7 point. This is good play. Rook fe1, then queen a4. This is a fatal error. All black needs to play is just rook c5 to try to get counterplay against this d-pawn. Getting counterplay so often is so key to even passively defending. No matter what you're doing, whether it's attacking, defending, any sort of position, you want to be looking for active possibilities for your side. Rook c5 is exactly the sort of thing that black wants to be doing. That d5 pawn is either a strength or a weakness, depending, but black wants to make it a weakness by getting play against it and attacking it, and forcing white to spend time defending it instead of just loading up for an attack. Rook c5 would do exactly that, whereas after queen a4, taking this queen away from the defense of the king side is fatal, and this allows white to suddenly mobilize a very nice king side attack. Queen f5, knight e4 was a little bit more incisive. I gave a couple different lines. After queen a2, rook x d5, knight f6, and this is decisive, because after this play like takes, queen takes f6. This is a very common ready theme. Just notice how incredibly strong this bishop on a1 suddenly is. This is, of course, completely decisive for whites. And this is often so very thematic for white in the ready. A lot of times the ready is thought of as sort of a boring positional opening. But in these lines where white achieves d4 and d5, that could be farther from the truth. And we'll see a Kramnik game later on that sort of puts the line more to that more so. These positions are incredibly dynamic, and that knight f6 move is incredibly thematic for this sort of position, just because this bishop on a1 and the long diagonal in general just ends up being so strong so often. So 94 is a little bit more incisive, but queen f5 is still good. 94, and black actually resigned here. This might seem a little bit premature, but it's really not. Just a couple of examples. If black plays rook g6, probably best is just to play h4. This rook just does not have any good squares. It's going to get buffaloed and corralled up. If rook d8, then we're just back to the same knight f6 theme. Pawn takes, and there's no response to a mate on the long diagonal. It might seem that this is coming out of nowhere, but really, it's the strength of this bishop on a1, which is so often, it's a direct consequence of the d4, d5 push, which is what we're examining. And the fact that black's kingside is basically completely deserted. And that's another consequence of the d4, d5 push. This incredibly strong pawn is cutting the board in half, more or less. You know, this rook on c8, this bishop on b7, this knight on a5, this queen on a4. All of them are completely cut off from the black kingside. So suddenly white's able to generate this attack seemingly out of nowhere because the black king is completely denuded. So this is incredibly thematic for these sorts of d4, d5 positions. So give this game a look. It is worth a study. It is very common for these sorts of ready variations plus hanging pawns in general. Thanks for tuning in. Tomorrow we're going to be looking more at another d4, d5 push game, and then I think we're going to move on to looking at how to fight against the hanging pawns. So my name is John. It's good to see you again.